Hello everybody. Today is another beautiful day here in Ireland in the early 20s already, although it's only 10 o'clock in the morning. And we've had very hot weather and I'm on holiday. Now, due to Corona, of course, I can't go anywhere. So I've decided to do something that I have been meaning to do for a very long time, because I've had questions on my channel when I worked out the different ways in which I was creating the adventures for my Erben des Schwarzen Eises quests and campaign, and I was asked would I do them in English as well, and I said, well, you know, they are quite long, and in the videos I actually created the campaign itself, the structure. I was doing a lot of writing down and diagrams and stuff, and there is no way I can redo this. Also, I don't have the time, and doing a voiceover is just way too time consuming. So I've decided to do a series of videos on how I create adventures, a campaign, etc., or what I do with, in my case, I'm going to talk about a pre-made campaign that I am going to play with a group of people, and how I'm going about it. And this time it will be all in English. So what I have always said, and I also said this in my How to Create a Side quest, which does exist in English, in the beginning, in my case, there isn't the word, but there is the world. And I have brought today a couple of books from different role-playing systems to illustrate two types of approaches to world building. Now, I'm not a paragon, so I don't go out there and I don't build my own worlds. I did a video on why I don't do this. So I actually want to have a world that is ready-made for me to delve into to create my adventures. And due to my preference, which I would describe as epic and immersive play style and GM style, it needs to be a world that is fully formed. I don't like systems where you have like the 11th version of a generic fantasy world, and the so-called history and world building consists of, oh, there are lots of forests there and there are lots of streams, it's all very wild, and here is a list of the last 5,000 kings and queens that have ruled this place. You kind of go, that's not, I don't consider this a history, I don't consider this a world that has been built. I consider this as interesting as the list of kings in ancient Egypt, which in and of itself is not interesting at all, except for the fact that these were real people, it's not fictitious, and we can try and find out more about their lives by looking at the archaeology. But of course, in a fictitious world, this doesn't work. So, what, generally speaking, types of world builds exist in RPGs? Well, on the one hand, and I've brought two examples, we have worlds that are built to be set in our world. Here, I've got the V20, Vampire the Masquerade, the 20th Anniversary Edition. It's the German version from World of Darkness. It's published by Ulysses Spiele and White Wolf. And here I've got Trail of Cthulhu, which is based in the Cthulhu universe, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And which was released by, it's based on the Gumshoe engine, for those of you who know it, it's a D6 system, and it was released by Pelgrane Press. Now, these two have one thing in common, and that is that the world that they are set in is our world. It's the Earth. For both, you have different epochs that are dealt with. So there is Vampire the Masquerade, which is usually set in today's world. So at the moment we're playing a campaign which is set in 2002. But there is also, as far as I know, a Dark Ages version of this. I'm not sure if the rule set is completely different if it was published by White Wolf, but it is possible to play this in a different epoch. And at the moment our GM is planning a Vampire the Masquerade V20 based in Victorian London. But again, it is based in our world. Call of Cthulhu, or Trail of Cthulhu, or let's just call it Cthulhu, is also set in our world. And depending on how you play, it can be either a very fictitious part of our world, namely Arkham and surroundings. Arkham was created by, of course, H.P. Lovecraft, where he set his stories of weird fiction, from which grew the Cthulhu mythos, which other authors contributed to, and which was then turned into a role-playing game, probably for the first time by Chaosium, but others have followed and others have used the Cthulhu mythos. But it is set on Earth again. And again, you have different epochs that are dealt with. You've got the classic Cthulhu period, which would be in the 1920s. Think Agatha Christie, Howard Carter, Tutankhamun, that kind of storyline. Then you've got Cthulhu by Gaslight, which I actually own. It came out as a box set. I don't know, probably in the 80s at some point. Then you've got Cthulhu Invictus, which is set in ancient Roman times. You've got Achtung Cthulhu, which is set during the Second World War. And you've got Cthulhu Now, which is set in the present day. And of course you've got Delta Green, which is Cthulhu-esque, but it's kind of different again from Cthulhu Now. It's got a slightly different rule set and a slightly different background. I always compare it to X-Files meets Cthulhu. But they both have in common that if you want to play them, and if you want to immerse your players or immerse yourself as the GM, which is sometimes probably even more important for me, because unless I can believe in a world, I can't write an adventure in it, you can rely on real world examples. So I rewrote two adventures. Well, I wrote one and I rewrote another for Call of Cthulhu only recently. The first one is set in a fictitious city, or really town rather, in England called Muscovy, and it deals with the legend of the Green Man, which is a probably even pre-Celtic, but definitely Celtic kind of being. We don't really know what he stood for, what he did, but he was then later on adopted into Christianity. You can find him in cathedrals and stuff, so he's used for ornamentation. But they basically associated the Green Man with some kind of Cthulhu mythos, god or monster, and basically then all hell broke loose. And when I read this adventure, I really liked it because it came with a very, very nice preset set of characters. And I will talk about characters and how they interact with the world in a later episode. I really loved it, and I decided I want to play this, but I don't want to set it in England because I was going to play in German with German players. And since the Green Man is essentially Celtic in origin, and the Celts lived, of course, in what is modern-day Germany as well, I decided that I'm going to try and find if I can find a place where we have the Green Man here in Germany. And I found the perfect town in the Hunsrück, which even has the Green Man's face in its heraldic symbol that represents the town, and it was just perfect. I found stuff online, I found photographs of the stela that represents the Green Man that was found there, and for the first time drawn during the almost during the 30 Years' War. So it's been known to be there for a very long time, and they've even got a little museum there, which is funny because in the actual story and in the actual adventure there is a museum there. I didn't even have to make this up. I could just take pictures from that museum because the museum actually exists and the town is perfect. So I just took the basic storyline and put it into the real world. Of course, the original adventure is also set in the real world, but in a city that doesn't exist. So I always prefer to go with things that do exist. First of all, because I enjoy it when I play a game, and I have an example and a very weird one later on for that. And then you suddenly meet something that is from this world. And it makes it even more real, and it gives it this touch of familiarity and this touch of, oh, somebody was really putting some thought into this. So that was my first example. The other one was, again, an adventure that I read, whose premise I really liked, but I decided I didn't want to set it in the 1920s, and I really, again, needed to bring in a believable background, a place that exists in a certain time with real people that has a history. Again, history is what world building is all about and what setting something in a world is about. And so I went to search for a place that fit my criteria. It had to be very much in the north of Alaska or Canada. It had to be on the coast. It had to have a lot of ice in winter. And I came across a place called Sachs Harbor, which is very small. It's close to a bird sanctuary. And it just fit my purpose completely. And then I found images that somebody had taken, pictures somebody had taken who was traveling there. And there was this picture of the inside of a hotel in Sachs Harbor, but apparently the hotel is no longer in use. So the snow had come in and had frozen over the interior of that place. And I was like, this is amazing. Just the picture itself was so evocative because it told the story in an image, which, if you were to tell it, would take you many sentences to describe, but you can just show this image to players and say, this is what it looks like, and they would go, how did the snow and the ice get into the hotel? Interestingly enough, again, serendipity, in the story, as it is initially told in the book that I took the idea from, there is a museum there. Guess what? Sachs Harbor has a nature museum where you find stuffed animals from the area, like muskoxen and whatnot. Again, it fit perfectly. So I always want to set things in a real world. When I was creating a character for Mage a couple of years ago, I knew it was going to be set in Boston, in modern day Boston. So I basically had this idea of what the character would do. So she would work with disenfranchised children and youths in a youth center. So I looked up youth centers in Boston, and just so that I had a name, what do they call them, where are they located, and then also in the evenings, because she doesn't make enough money, she works in an adult video store. So I googled adult video stores to find a couple of names of those, and then basically I built this into my story because I want the story to be real, and to me this makes it very real. Which is also why I like using maps. So Google Maps is really brilliant for this because you can really show people a map of, this is what, for example, when we played the Sachs Harbor Call of Cthulhu adventure, it was a military adventure. So I gave them basically the satellite view of Sachs Harbor. I annotated it a little bit to make it fit the story, because in my story there is a mine there, which isn't there in the real world, but I was able to put it in there. But you know, they are military personnel, so they would be shown satellite images of the target area where they are going to be deployed to. So it is so easy today to find stuff and to use it and to bring to bear on the story and to move the story along as well, because as a GM, you have to do a lot of stuff anyway. But if you then can bring in a prop, and I play online, so the props that I have need to be in the form of images. I can't give them physical stuff. But if you have a prop, like a map, like an image, like maybe even real world texts that you can bring in. So here I'm talking about primary texts. So for those of you who may not know what this refers to, in linguistics and also literature, we distinguish between primary texts and secondary texts. The primary text, for example, would be the Iliad by Homer. And if I were to sit down and write something very unintelligent about the Iliad and explain what it means, that would be a secondary text. So primary texts are the equivalent of maps and props on a literary level. But it doesn't have to be literary text. It can also be, for example, the theory of relativity as published by Einstein when he first brought it out in this peer-reviewed magazine where he first published it. It can be anything that is written in the world, not about the world, but in the world. And of course, when you play in the real world, regardless of how much fiction is generated by the adventure system you're playing within the world, any text can be used. I, for example, when I play Call of Cthulhu, never use works by Lovecraft, and I don't use Arkham, because to me that defies the purpose. I want to play Call of Cthulhu, if I play Call of Cthulhu, in the idea of it's the normal world where Lovecraft doesn't exist, because Lovecraft essentially invented the mythos, then it doesn't work. But suddenly the mythos, however you define it, and I usually don't play with mythos creatures because I don't find them very scary, or very interesting for that matter, seeps into the real world. So when I play Call of Cthulhu, or when I run a Call of Cthulhu game, Lovecraft doesn't exist, Arkham doesn't exist, his fiction doesn't exist. However, Robert E. Howard does exist. He's the other great weird fiction writer with his Conan the Cimmerian cycle. He does exist. And when I play Call of Cthulhu, and I do have a character in a campaign that's at the moment on hold, she actually reads Robert E. Howard. It's set in the 1920s and she's an avid fan. Then, of course, the next question in the world is, how weird is it? So Call of Cthulhu can be played in many ways. So you have a very, very normal world, and then something slightly weird seeps in and you try to investigate it. Or you have World of Darkness, which is very weird to begin with, because you play, at least in everything that I have looked at so far, Changeling the Lost, Changeling the Dreaming, Mage, Vampire, Werewolf, Scion, I think is also definitely a Mummy, and Prometheus. You don't play normal people, you play special beings. So you can play a vampire, you can play a werewolf, you can play a mage. Even in Hunter the Vigil, I think hunters come closest to normal human beings in that they don't really have special powers, but they know that something is going on. But here the weirdness is ubiquitous. It's ever present. It's ever present. It's always there. It's around you, and you are even part of the weirdness. Whereas in Call of Cthulhu, you usually do not play cultists. You may, but usually you play normal people to whom really weird things happen. So, what do I use to bring life to this? Well, I've already told you the internet is a great place. I also have books, and I mean many books. I love history. I've got a whole shelf of books about ancient history upstairs. I like archaeology. I've got books about digs basically around the globe, in North America, South America. Australia is the only continent that I haven't covered. Asia, etc. Europe, of course. So whenever you play something with Call of Cthulhu, where you try to bring in the old stuff, either because you're playing a classic adventure where somebody's on a dig, classic Call of Cthulhu, I can bring in the photographs. But then there are other things. How do I make things interesting? So, for example, this is a primary text. It's the Dictionary of Symbols. So basically what this does is it brings in symbols that exist in our world. So, for example, here we've got the Arcana of the Tarot. Other symbols that exist are, for example, the bear. What do bears signify in history, in storytelling, in our culture? So there are plenty of books. I think that there is one also published by Penguin, and Geek Gamers uses this one because I saw her use it the other day in one of her videos, and you can get them. I mean, this is a German book, obviously, but they exist in English as well. So it basically makes it possible for me to inspire myself, but also to, when I come across something, to kind of think about, okay, what could this mean? So this is a very eclectic work. So, for example, it also contains the motorbike. And it basically gives you a short description of what motorbikes mean in modern culture. So for example, you have got Easy Rider is mentioned, then of course Harley Davidson is mentioned, Hell's Angels are mentioned as well. So just to give you a kind of an idea of that this is really popular culture. It's really eclectic. So you've got here Oedipus and the Sphinx, you know. So you want to know something, you go to this. And I've got the same about ancient Greece as well. Basically a list of a dictionary about ancient Greece. I've got a dictionary of Britain even. So when I want to kind of like inspire myself, I can go there. Then of course, and this is what I was talking about earlier, there are other books. And this is one which, the book itself isn't important, but it's the person who wrote it. It's Lafcadio Hearn. Now Lafcadio Hearn is an interesting person, to say the least. He used to be quite famous, but I don't think he's famous anymore. I don't think that lots of people still know him. Lafcadio Hearn lived from 1850 to 1904. He has Irish roots, as so many people do, but he's also got Greek roots. Lafcadio, that's a Greek name. And he was a journalist, and he spent a lot of time in Japan, where he wrote interesting articles and sketches, and he also wrote about America. And I first heard of Lafcadio Hearn, I want to say in 2014, or maybe, when did he die? Did he die in 1904? Yes, that would have been 110 years, so maybe it was like his 110th anniversary. And I was driving home after a conference that I had attended, and he was there was a kind of like a report on him on Irish on the Irish National Irish radio station, RTE. And I was just fascinated by this person and what they were telling me about him. And I got the book. I got one of the books. I haven't really read much, but I will actually do this because I basically have time now, because my studies, my semester ended early because of Corona, and I don't have to study because I'm just gonna pass based on continuous assessment. So I'm gonna read this. This is my next read. And I completely forgot about him for several years, until 2 years ago I played a computer game called Dead Secret. And there's actually a video on my channel where I play through that game, or a couple of videos. And it's kind of Asian Japanese themed. Now he worked as a journalist in Japan. And this person, the first person player, enters into this house and basically tries to investigate a death. And there are books, and this person, it's actually a woman, she's a journalist as well, she goes through a stack of books, and there are books by Lafcadio Hearn on the shelf. They mean nothing, they don't impact the story at all, but they are works by Lafcadio Hearn on Japan. And this is what I mean by, if you set something in a world and you manage to bring in-world primary items like primary texts, images, maps, etc., it just bolsters the credibility of the world that you're producing. And the fact that in this completely weird B-movie style cheap computer game that has a completely different topic that they're dealing with, up pops a book by Lafcadio Hearn simply because it might make sense for a Japanophile to have a book by Lafcadio Hearn about Japan, is just totally overwhelming. I was there and I liked the nod to my real world, to my real culture, to my real experience by the people who made that video game, because it basically grounded it 1 inch more deeply in the here and now and in our reality. And this is what I think my most important task is when I first sit down to create a game, to ground it in the world. And of course, grounding it in the here and now or in the real world is a lot easier because we simply know a lot more about it. It becomes a lot more difficult when you deal with fictitious worlds. And I also brought 2 examples of games that are set in fictitious worlds. The first one is called The One Ring. It's based on The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, and I believe that probably J.R.R. Tolkien is the best world builder, bar none. His world is the deepest, richest world that has ever been built. And for those of you who say, yeah, but George R.R. Martin did a decent job, but it doesn't compare. And The Dark Eye. This is the English version of the core rulebook. And there are estimates that actually not, this world, Aventuria, is probably the world about which most role-playing materials have ever been written in the last 30-odd years since its inception. I think in 1986, so that's now 34 years. When I deal with fictitious worlds, again, I'm looking for a rich, in-depth world that doesn't just consist of a list of 5,000 rulers, and that's like 5,000 years of history, or 5,000 years of history with 500 rulers. If they all ruled for 10 years, then that kind of evens itself out. I want texture. I want a map. I want climate descriptions. I want a description of the pantheon, if it exists. Of course, in The Lord of the Rings, there are no gods. They don't exist anymore. Well, they do exist, but they don't play a part in the actual world at all. I want to know about the peoples, about their history, how do they belong together, what kind of languages do they speak, what are their belief systems, what is their way of making a living. Are they agricultural people? Are they hunters and gatherers, maybe Neolithic? Are they warriors? Are they peace-like? Are they diplomats? Are they inventors? All of this needs to be described. All of this needs to make sense. I need to know about the physical reality of the world. So what does the world's physics look like? Most worlds that I've encountered that are set on a planet, on a form of planet, abide by the laws of physics that we have here on Earth. When you throw something in the air, it usually falls down again, unless you use magic. Next point, does magic exist? If so, how does it manifest itself? Is it everywhere, like in Splittermond, where every single person has some form of magic ability? Only there are people who are more adept and who are better. They are actual mages, and everybody else is just basically dabbles in magic, but they are imbued with magic power. Or is it completely amagical, like The Lord of the Rings? Because even what Gandalf is able to do is it is magic, but it's very, very limited, and it's only very few people who can use it. And this whole question about what does the magic of the elves actually mean is something that is still unanswered. You know, it's not really like Galadriel sits there and casts spells to make Lorien look nice. What is the hierarchy like? Is it a democracy? Is it an empire? Do they have kings? So in The Dark Eye, you find many, many countries that adhere to the feudal system, where you have an emperor at the top. In this case, at the moment, it's an empress, actually. And you have feudal lords below them. But then again, you have other areas where you have, for example, in the city of Festum, where you have the rich merchants, and they form basically the government of that particular city, and they are very independent of all of the other areas around it. They actually are completely separate from the political system that runs the rest of the country that Festum is set in. So it's kind of like a free city, like, for example, the old cities of the Hansa were, like Hamburg, Visby, etc. They had different laws from the areas around them. And even today in Germany, Hamburg and Bremen, as former Hanseatic cities, are free cities, and they form federal entities unto themselves. They are small entities, okay, but they're still entities on themselves. If you're wondering what's happening, the kitten is trying to kill the big cardboard box. I also need to understand things like, how are men and women treated? Are they treated equally? Do they have equal opportunities, or don't they? Or is there a kind of hierarchy? Do people keep slaves? Because there is one group of people in the Dark Eye that keep slaves. And they actually make money selling and buying slaves. And then there is another group of people. They are like Vikings, and they go and rape and pillage. But what they also do is they kill anyone and everyone who owns slaves, and they free all the slaves. So they are a very interesting people, because on the one hand they behave very, very badly, and in a criminal way. But on the other hand, as soon as they see a slaver, they will actually stop at nothing to free the slaves and to bring that person to justice, which in their case means killing them outright. So again, a very interesting dynamic there. And why do I need to do this? Why do I need to know this? Why is this important? Well, first of all, again, it is important for me personally, because I need to be able to breathe that world. I need to be able to feel that world. If I'm going to run an adventure, let alone a campaign, in a world that to me seems shallow, I'm not interested. I want to be able to believe in this world. It's important to me. But also, I need to know all of these things in order to be able to play believable NPCs. So an example would be, if I know, and let's take an example from our world, that when you go into a synagogue as a man, you have to wear a hat, or you have to cover your head at least. That is actually not true for Christian churches, where you have to remove your hat. If I don't know this and I walk into a synagogue, I'm committing a faux pas. It's unpleasant, it's embarrassing, blah, blah, blah. However, if I do know and I'm still not putting on a hat, that's a conscious decision that has a meaning. Okay? Now, if I don't know such details about the fictitious world that I'm playing in, I may be doing something with my NPC that may bear meaning that I'm not aware of. And it becomes even more problematic when you play with really experienced players like I do. One of my players is actually an author for the Dark Eye. He has probably read everything that's ever been written for the Dark Eye, okay? So, and that's saying something, because we've got 30 odd years worth of material. So it is important to me to understand this and to know this, to make it believable, because the players that I play with also want to be immersed. And if there is a jarring contradiction of what I say happens, or what my NPCs do with what they expect, or what it says in the long history of Aventuria, then there has to be a reason. It has to be a damn good reason, because it impacts the way the story unfolds. And it's a lot easier when we're playing in our own world, because we usually know how people in Ireland behave, how people in Germany behave, what you do when you go into a Christian church. So for example, when you go into a church, into an Orthodox church in Greece, which is sometimes a bit bad for all female visitors, because in summer, when they're on holiday, they usually wear short skirts or even shorts. You can't do that. You can't show your knee when you go into an Orthodox church. So people are asked to actually put on long trousers or a long skirt. But if you don't, and lots of tourists don't, you actually cause offence. You can make a decision to do this. Well, I'm a tourist, who cares? But your action has a consequence, and that's how people will regard you. And the same is true for people in a role-playing game. When one of my players does something and I make sure that they realize, because it could be that they don't know, that this would be strange or it would be unsuitable behavior for a particular occasion, and they still proceed, then they have to bear the consequences. They have to accept that this will lead to them being regarded as strange. They may even be sent away. They may not get the information that they were going for. They may even get arrested. But again, for this to work, I need to know the world. And when you then look at worlds, it is also nice to be able to have primary text, because of course this is a rule book. This is also a rule book. So these are all secondary texts. Of course, for all of these, we've got regional descriptions, source books, they are called. They are also mainly secondary texts because somebody describes something. However, for the Dark Eye, we also have primary texts, and we call them in-game texts. So this is one of them that I brought. This is a religious text set in the Dark Eye. It's called the Rondra Vademecum. Traditionally, the Dark Eye has a pantheon of 12 gods, which is the pantheon that most people believe in. There are also other belief systems, but mostly it's a 12 god pantheon. Rondra is the goddess of war. And this is the prayer book that her clerics use. So this is a primary text which contains cat pictures, of course, and prayers for different occasions. And they exist for all of the 12, and I think for some of the half-gods as well. So that's a primary text that is written simply for the enjoyment of the players. You don't have to use it. Having said this, the Dark Eye also has a very, very strong LARP community, so of course for them this is very important as well. For the older versions of the Dark Eye, there are a lot of in-game texts which basically tell in the form of, for example, of travel logs about a certain area. And again, that's an in-game primary text. Somebody, a fictitious person, goes to a fictitious world and writes about it. It's not somebody explaining, okay, so basically here you've got woods. If you want to hunt there, you have to roll for the following results in order to be successful. It is somebody describing, oh, and I went hunting, and guess what we found? We found wild boar. And the more you have, and the more I have, the more to life can I bring our story. And that's why, to me, the world is the most important thing, because the world tells me where we are, where we can go, where we have been, and by we, I actually mean the world itself, because I really, really believe in the importance of history. If we don't remember what we did 1,000 years ago, or if we don't take it seriously, we will repeat it, and unfortunately we see this happening at the moment as well. So basically right-wing extremism is on the rise, and also people of right-wing extremist beliefs have come to power across the world. Very, very disturbing, because we don't pay attention to this, because we do say, oh yeah, that was yesterday. Well, it wasn't. And the same is true, of course, of a fictitious world. I want to know what happened before, because what happened before informs where we are today, and it also informs our thought processes and our ideas. I mean, if we hadn't had Reformation, we would still believe that the Catholic Church was all-encompassing and very, very important, and the only way you could talk to your God was through a priest, until Martin Luther said, no, that's not the case. You can actually talk straight away directly to the man. And I'm also going to translate the Bible for you, that you can take God's word and read it yourself. And I'm not a religious person at all, but I'm just giving these examples because they are probably the ones that were most important at some point in time to advance mankind. Or for example, things like the fact that the church tried to suppress the heliocentric world view, which we know is true. So first of all, the world is not a disc, it's a sphere, and it also circles around the sun. The sun is at the center of our solar system. It's not a geocentric system, it's a solar system, and it's heliocentric. But the church decided that this was knowledge that it didn't want to be made known. We also know that the church destroyed forever very, very important writings from ancient Greece and ancient Rome, because they were written by heathens, so people who wrote before the time of Christ, so they were heathens, so their word had to be the devil's word. And the reason why we still have a lot of works by the philosophers, by the mathematicians, Plato, Aristotle, etc., is because some of it was found in the original Greek, but also because of the translation movement, which was invented by the Muslim rulers, who basically wanted knowledge. They wanted the books, but they didn't speak Greek, they didn't speak Latin. So in their occupied territories, even in Spain, of what is today Spain, they actually paid translators, and they were sitting side by side. So there was this guy that spoke Greek, and the guy that spoke Hebrew, and the guy that spoke Latin, and they would be speaking to each other, and then it would be translated into Arabic. That's how we retained quite a lot of knowledge, through a translation into Arabic. Because they believed they were not inhibited by this idea of, oh, this was written by somebody who was not a Muslim, i.e. not a Christian, so it has to be the devil's work. That came later for them. So again, you have all of this information that's there, and you have to bring it in. And this is why most role-playing game systems or worlds hold no interest to me, because they are just shallow. And they become very disjointed. So when we look at, for example, Golarion, and when you play an adventure path in Pathfinder, for example, and you played through, and we played the Jade region to the end, it had no impact on the mummy. It was like, okay, it never happened. It's just this lack of consistency and coherence and interlinkedness that then destroys the idea of, yes, I am actually in another world. So the world comes first. Now that we've decided what the world is, in this case it's going to be the Dark Eye, because that's what I'm running my campaigns for at the moment. The next point will be the party or the players, and that's going to be my next video. Until then, have a nice day. Bye bye.